right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our early bird special addressing common questions about fencing. This will be presented by Braun Gresham Attorney and Counselor Carly Barton. This is a brief presentation before we kick off our property tax options presentation at 6 p.m. Because we are so limited on time, we will not be taking questions for this portion of the presentation, but we will be providing Carly's contact information at the end in case you'd like to submit a follow-up question that way. And I will also be taking her contact information and sticking that in the chat box, so you can copy and paste that if you need to. And now, Carly, feel free to take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carly Barton. Like Avalon said, I'm an attorney at Braun Gresham. We are a law firm that primarily focuses on representing rural landowners and all of their needs. So that definitely is a wide range of topics, but I primarily focus on the litigation side and in condemnation. So I'm here to talk to you about common questions I get about fencing. Unfortunately, the saying that good fences make good neighbors is true. And so a lot of times when there's boundary disputes and fencing disputes, we see those at Braun Gresham. So I'm here to talk about those with how we can avoid those and some advice moving forward. So here are the top 3 questions I get on our fencing issues is who owns the fence? What can I do with my fence? And who has to pay for that fence? And really the answers to these questions depend on 2 considerations. First is where exactly the fence is located, and then who built that fence. So if your fence is on your side of the property line, meaning that even if it's an inch within your property line, that is your fence and it is your exclusive property, and you can do whatever you want to with it because it is just yours. So your neighbors cannot tear it down or do anything like that. Now, if it's close enough to the boundary line, your neighbors might be able to benefit from that fence. And what I mean in that case is they might be able to run their fencing from one of its posts or attach something to that fence. If they wanted to subdivide their land in some way, they could avail themselves to using that fence, but it is your exclusive property. So if you wanted to tear it down, you could. The other consideration, so most of the time, not all the time, but I'd like to say most of the time, our fences are on the boundary line, right? It's on the exact border between your property and your neighbor's property. And if a fence is there, who owns the fence depends on who built it. So if you were the person who built the fence or made that initial step to enclose your land, that is your fence if you put it on the boundary line. So you built it, it's yours, it's your private property. Now, when it's on the boundary line, it does become a little more of a fuzzy area of law because your neighbors can use it to help in to enclose their property and use it as a boundary for that. So putting a fence on this line, the owner of the adjacent land can avail himself to the advantage, is how the Texas Supreme Court says it, but they would not incur any liability for using that fence. And so what do I mean by that? They are not responsible for contributing any kind of maintenance or paying to replace it or anything like that. So what can I do with my fence? Well, if you built it, you can tear it down. So you do have that ability. You can replace it. if that fence has been there a really long time and you have no idea who built that fence and it's been around for ages and ages, and neither side can really lay claim to who built the fence, then you can certainly tear that fence down and build your own. And kind of one of the most important questions I get a lot of the times is, who has to pay for the fence? Can I force my neighbor to pay for the fence? And unfortunately, the answer to that is no. You cannot force your neighbor to help you pay to replace a fence if it's destroyed by natural causes or anything else. A neighbor does not have any obligation to rebuild the fence if they don't want to. So who has to pay for the fence? You do. If you want one, you have to pay for it. So that's the general concepts that surround fence law and who owns what. There are some important considerations to think about if you live in an open range county or closed range county, and animal and livestock liability if your animals aren't fenced into certain standards. I'm not going to go into that here because I've only got 15 minutes, but if you are interested in that, or you have questions about liability for your animals and them escaping, I'm certainly happy to talk to you later on. But so now that we have kind of a quick overview of what should a landowner do when they have fencing issues. So my number one piece of advice when it comes to fencing problems is talk to your neighbor. It seems like something so simple and obvious, and most people with common sense would go and contact their neighbor about their fence. But every type of dispute I've had between neighbors has always been that they didn't talk to their neighbor first. So your neighbor, you might think, oh, I'm doing this great benefit, I'm replacing the fence. Both sides are obviously going to want that. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal to a lot of neighbors. And even just having that conversation kind of eases the tension between everyone. And particularly when you're talking about areas of land that are more wooded or have pretty trees, finding that fence line and clearing the fence line to say install a new fence. Sometimes you don't have the most accurate surveys or most accurate boundary lines. And so you don't want people going in there just clearing a whole swath of land and clearing on your neighbor's land, because that can really cause some issues. So please, please, please talk to your neighbor. I'll give a quick anecdote. This advice is very important, and my parents did not take this advice. They had a neighbor who had recently built a pretty large privacy fence because they have a very narrow lot that looks out onto Lake Marble Falls, and so they built this privacy fence to kind of shield the two homes, and the neighbors built it up high to where they couldn't see, essentially you couldn't see whether there was water flowing. And it was really only like probably about half a foot, maybe 12 inches, that my parents wanted the fence lowered so they could see out to see if the water was running and if you could go down to the lake and enjoy it. But when my parents, the fence went up, my parents were really upset because their neighbors didn't come and talk to them about it. And then in my response to their complaints was, well, the fence is theirs and it's on their property, so you can't really complain about it. But my first question to them was, well, did you talk to your neighbor? So it really can be it seems so simple, but it's really the best piece of advice I can give to anyone when they've got fencing issues. The other big concern is you've got to locate the correct property boundary line. You need to find your survey pins, figure out where that exact line is, and you cannot assume that your current fence line is the correct fence line. And that is also very, very important. Many times we have old fences that have been around for forever, or people just continue to rebuild and inch it further into land when they rebuild the fences. And so be sure before you do any kind of removing of a fence, or putting up a fence, or maintaining one, or moving it anyway, you certainly need to locate that true property boundary. And it's very, very important, because your original fence line is not always the case, that is the true boundary to your property. My next piece of advice is use professionals. So particularly a surveyor, if there's any kind of question as to where that boundary is, particularly if after you talk to your neighbor and there's concern, or nobody knows where the true fence line is, or there's a dispute about that, getting a surveyor out there, locating the pins, staking the line, those things can, making sure both sides agree where that property line is before you build a fence, really can prevent some disputes down the line, or doing something that's going to get you in trouble with your neighbor. Also, your construction crew, or whoever's clearing your property, make sure those people know what is your property, what is your neighbor's property. Like I said, most of my disputes that come with fencing and property boundaries is someone didn't talk to their neighbor, and then a crew goes out there and just clears the entire fence line and clears onto the neighbor's property. And of course your neighbor's mad because you tore down their trees. So you need to make sure that you're using professionals, that they know where the property boundary line is, so they're not clearing on the wrong side of things, and taking good care of knowing where that line is. And my last piece of advice is, get an agreement in place with your neighbor if you can. Now, these are rare, they don't happen too frequently, but if there is some sort of dispute, or if there is some sort of agreement that can be reached between the neighbors in terms of maintenance or cost sharing, things are, gates, things like that, it's always nice to get in a quick written agreement in place, so that both sides feel comfortable with what's going on. Both sides can, knows the expectations and the rights or responsibilities of each side. So those are my quick things you should do when you're considering building, removing, replacing a fence, that can, prevent disputes in the future and prevent you from any lawsuits. Because let me tell you, it's always easier to prevent the dispute than to fix it on the back end. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with my contact information. So if you have any further questions, or kind of have a little more of a nuanced question for me, feel free to reach out. This is our phone number at the office, my email address. Be happy to talk to you about any kind of fencing concerns that you might have. Like I said, we deal a lot with boundary disputes and neighbors, and it is something we frequently deal with because we represent rural landowners. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, or if unfortunately you're already in a dispute with your neighbor about it, we can talk about ways to try and problem solve and move forward with that. So thank you so much for kind of listening to this little early bird spiel. I'm going to leave you with Avalon and Nick to talk with Plateau about property tax options for landowners. I hope you enjoy it. They've got a lot of great information for you. We love working with our sister company, Plateau Land and Wildlife, and we hope that you enjoy it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Carly. You have a good rest of your night.
Thank you.